Friends, today's NRI Samay program from Los Angeles brought to you commercial free by listeners like you. Your generous donations make possible for us to stay commercial free. This is a live show and our guest will be happy to answer any of your questions. If you have a question for the guest, please leave a message on the chat window on nrisamay.com/live. Thank you for your support.
Good morning, good evening to all our listeners on NRI Samay. Today we have a interesting topic that most of the so-called urbanites, and I'm being one of them, will be curious about or interested to know, especially in the context of the new state that has been formed recently, Telangana, and I'm specifically talking about Hyderabad. Hyderabad has been racing towards urbanization for almost a decade now, to a point where it has almost become stagnant, and maybe there's no more scope for any more urbanization. But urbanization is such a broad concept that it's very hard to define with a specific boundary. But to talk about urbanization, its implications, what does it mean for a city to be urbanized? We have with us, and it's a great privilege to welcome Anant Maringanti, who is he has many he wears many hats. One of them is a geographer with a PhD from University of Minnesota, and he's also worked in the capacity of a professor. He has taught at the University of Hyderabad and National University of Singapore. And currently, he is the director of a non-profit organization called Hyderabad Urban Lab. So, Anant, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Suresh, for having me.
Thank you. So, I'd like to start off with saying, how would you define urbanization, and to be more specific in the context of Hyderabad as you see things today?
In general, urbanization is actually, there are technical definitions for what we mean by urbanization. Normally what happens is that each country has its own definition of what urban means. In India, what we mean by urban is normally two things. One is a statistical definition of a rural area becoming urban. And that would mean that less than 75% of the population should be involved in agriculture as a primary occupation. When you have 75% of the population involved in agriculture as a primary occupation, that's a rural area. You also have definitions of size, which is that anything more than 5,000 population, and there's a particular density of population, which is also taken into account. But normally what also happens is that governments declare particular areas as urban, right? So you have two different definitions of the urban. One coming from the census, which looks at population size, density, and also the primary dependence on agriculture. And then you have the government declaring particular areas as urban, and there's a gap between the two. There are many places which normally, technically, by census definition should be urban, but it is not declared by the government as urban. So within the larger urban conglomeration of Hyderabad, you would still have lots of villages which are governed by gram panchayats, which receive rural development grants and so on and so forth, but actually, by census definition, they are not rural anymore. Because the population has grown beyond a certain level, because the density has increased and people are not dependent on agriculture as primary occupation. So that's the issue with urbanization. You have a very large urban conglomeration called Hyderabad, within which there are several rural pockets, which by census definition have already become urban, but by government definition, they are still rural. So that's how the urbanization story actually works up, in the Indian case at least.
Okay. Now, we have seen that, ever since the late 90s, Hyderabad has opened itself for MNCs to come in, and a lot of software companies even within India had set up their huge offices in these campuses. And also because of that, the direct impact was on real estate and all the people from the rural migrating to Hyderabad, creating tremendous amount of stress and creating this entire amount of population that is caught up in this flux. So how much do you think these factors are taken into account when the so-called urbanization of a city happens?
So this, Suresh, is actually to do with the question of not so much about how much urbanization, but about what kind of urbanization. Right, as I said, in the census definition, the dependency on agriculture is, if it is one main consideration, you already have an economic definition of urbanization there, right? Normally what happens is that the assumption in much of urban theory is that when agricultural surpluses get reinvested in manufacturing, modern industry, modern service sector, so on and so forth, that's when you have urbanization of a particular kind happening. The general trajectory, which is supposed to be a good trajectory across the world, simply because of that has been the trajectory of Europe and North America, is that you move from agriculture to manufacturing, from primary sector activities into secondary sector activities, which is manufacturing. And from that you move into service sector. What has happened in India, as in many countries like India, is that that process has not taken the same trajectory. So in Hyderabad, if you look at the last 20 years, essentially what happened is the tremendous growth in economic terms has happened because of the service sector, right? The information technology sector.
Right.
So we basically bypassed the manufacturing sector, which is the reason why you find a lot of critics of this kind of urbanization and growth making the argument that somehow we have missed the correct path to development. We have not built our manufacturing capabilities. We have jumped from primary sector activities directly into service sector activities, which is where the growth is coming from, right? That's where the big money is being made.
Right.
So when there is a certain kind of big money being made in smaller number of jobs, we get what is normally called by economists in India who are critical of this trajectory, a jobless growth. Right? So you see growth, you see economic growth, you see what looks like prosperity, but we are not creating sufficient number of jobs. So what's actually happening to people? Right? And if you look at that question as to what is happening when growth is taking place, but not enough formal jobs are being created, what you see is a tremendous growth in what is known as the informal sector. Right? So you have people coming into the city, trying to find a place in the city because agriculture is not doing very well, because facilities are not being created in the rural areas. Urbanization has not been uniform, right? You can't really look at IT jobs in smaller towns. And they can be at some point of time when connectivity is strong enough.
Right.
Still. So you have people from rural areas moving into the city for any number of reasons, for good education for their children, for health facilities, for improving their incomes, simply because you can escape the caste operation in the village, you come into the city. All kinds of reasons. When this happens and the city does not have enough proper regular employment opportunities for them, they all figure out some ways of surviving in this city, right? So where do they go? They go into pretty much stuff that could be subcontracted jobs. They would be picking up a lot of self-employment opportunities. They get into informal service provision on the fringes of the big growth. So that's what we're seeing in Hyderabad, right? So you see a huge increase in paratransit, auto rickshaws, for example.
True.
Okay? I mean, this is a city which has something like 1 lakh auto rickshaws officially plying within the core area of the city.
Wow.
And just think about the numbers, right? 1 lakh auto rickshaws officially with permits. That means that even if you think of something like 1.5 driver per vehicle, you're looking at 1.5 lakh drivers. And if each of those drivers is supporting a family of 4, you're looking at a 6 lakh population. That's just the official number. And that's like something like 10% of the core area's population.
Right.
Depending simply on auto rickshaws, right? You have similar things happening in sanitation. You have similar things happening in food. This is what is actually sustaining the city. Huge number of people coming into this informal economy. And the unfortunate thing, the reason why cities like this do not work very well beyond a certain point is that policy just doesn't know what to do with them. Right? Policy lenses are mostly about what it can recognize and count. Right? It can count the number of people who are in the IT sector and the money that is coming in because you have income tax. How do you calculate the contribution of auto rickshaw drivers to the city's economy? So they just stay off the radar completely.
So given this context, given the context that at least in the case of Hyderabad, where and how would you see the Hyderabad Urban Lab, your organization, fits in, and why do you think there is a need for such an organization?
So the reason why we started Hyderabad Urban Lab as a research program is because we felt that it's important to make visible the bulk of what our economy is really about, right? This is not to in any way undervalue the IT sector or any other fields, because it's precisely because you have those technologies that we are able to do a lot of things that we want to do, even in our own work. But the important thing is that we need to, for example, you have a transportation policy for the city. You have a mobility plan, right? That mobility plan has very little understanding of the contribution of this 1.5 lakh auto rickshaw drivers. You have, if I'm saying 1.5 lakh auto rickshaw drivers, there must be easily another 5-6 lakh people who depend on auto rickshaws for their mobility in the city simply for work, right? Because this is a city in which you don't have public transportation very well organized. There are lots of places which are not easy to reach. So if you have 10, 20, 30% of the city depending on this thing called the informal economy, pretty much for their livelihoods, how do we make them visible? How do we understand those sectors? How do we tell those stories? How do we even do this research? Unfortunately, what happens is that much of the academic research, of which I'm a part, has been driven by certain kinds of protocols. Right? How do you do research? What categories? Where do you draw data from? And so on. And the available tools are not necessarily helping us in making sense of the world around us. So Hyderabad Urban Lab's main goal when we started was to try and see if we can create new kinds of urban theory from Hyderabad. And one of the reasons why we chose to start work in Hyderabad and called this Hyderabad Urban Lab is because I have been part of a series of conversations over the years where we have felt that Hyderabad has a unique situation in Indian cities. Right? At the time of independence, this was one of the larger cities outside of the four seats of British power. The 3 port cities of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, and then you have Delhi. Outside of these, Hyderabad was a very large city. Hyderabad had its own railway, it had its own bus system, it had its own, entire infrastructure. And then, as it becomes part of the larger story of Indian modernization, the intersection between Hyderabad's history and Indian history somehow resulted in erasing some parts of that history, right? We forget about what these specificities are and what they mean. So we thought that that city would allow us to do new kinds of research, build new kinds of concepts and theories that could be useful even for other cities. Right? Normally, in urban research, what happens is you take one paradigmatic city, study it carefully, build theory, and that theory is then applied to other cities. Usually we do work with theory that originates in Chicago. Chicago School of Urban Sociology is a very, very powerful model. You have people who worked on Los Angeles, and that becomes theory. You have people working on London, and that becomes theory. Why can't Hyderabad be a site of theory making? Right? Why do we have to work with lenses that come from elsewhere? So this was the primary goal. But doing that simply means that you have to be grounded in communities and ask questions from the ground level. So we started working very closely with groups of people who have particular kinds of problems, and they want to know why they have those problems. So we start from that end and start looking at how theory and policy and knowledge around these problems is shaping that problem itself. So that's what we've been doing.
So what specific areas did you concentrate so far, or in all these years since this organization has been in? Can you share any significant research details? Sure. So, for example, Hyderabad Urban Lab is actually not a very old organization. We started 2 years ago. But within these 2 years, we have actually put together a tremendous amount of data and insights. One thing that we have always tried to make sure is that we have one foot in the academic world. So we publish our research as articles in refereed journals. But at the other end, we also try and make our knowledge publicly accessible, both in terms of data and in terms of the stories that we are putting together. Okay? So the first project that we actually started working on was this place called Bholakpur, which is a small municipal ward in the middle of Hyderabad. And this particular ward in the year 2009 had a calamity striking it, with the drinking water supply getting contaminated with sewage. So with the contamination of sewage, people were struck by E. colitis, and about 10 or 15 people died, about 1,000 people got hospitalized, and so on. And the area is actually, historically, it has been the area of leather tanning, and also plastic scrap trading right now. In the last 15 or 20 years, that leather tanning has completely stopped. But before it stopped, it reached a point where a lot of industrial chemicals were being used. So the soil is very deeply contaminated with heavy metal presence, which can be very, very cancer-causing kind of thing. But the interesting thing was that the response of the government and the media to this problem of E. colitis was that if we remove all of this scrap activity and leather activity from Bholakpur, the problem will be solved. And we were puzzled by this. Right? Water gets contaminated with sewage, which has nothing to do with scrap, which has nothing to do with leather, and yet somehow that is seen as the problem which has caused the contamination of water. People in Bholakpur itself were saying that, look, it has to do with sewage entering drinking water. What does leather processing or scrap trading have to do with this? So what we then started doing was to look at the infrastructure in the place, how that infrastructure went through a series of negligences by the government, but also look at the older histories of that place, how the
the location itself became such a concentrated area of scrap. It's a fascinating area in the sense that almost all kinds of waste from the city, electronic waste, plastics, steel, iron, shoes, clothes, everything reaches Bolakpur. It gets segregated there and then gets sent off to other places.
Mm-hmm.
There are about 30,000 people who are actually involved in this. And to us, intellectually, as a research problem, this was an ideal site of what the Indian economy is all about. So you have something like 700, 800, 900 firms working in this area, each employing 2, 3, 4 people. Right? Micro firms, that's what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the last budget speech, in which the paragraph 101, I think, talks about small and medium enterprises, and there was a response actually from a very noted economist called Barbara Harris White, who said that, look, what this is missing out is on the micro firms in India. Mm-hmm. Micro enterprises, which constitute about 90% of the economy, which have an average employment size of 2 to 2.5. That's what the bulk of our economy is, which just doesn't get counted. And Bolakpur was such a concentrated area where we could find all these firms. So we started studying this. We created a lot of spatial data. And in starting doing this, one of the things that we did was to actually build an online mapping platform, which then became very useful for us in a lot of other research, right? Once you have the tools to put together the GIS data related to places, people, economic flows, and so on, and you can visualize and analyze it, you can do really, really great things with cities. So that work that we did in Bolakpur has been published in academic journals. We work very closely with the community, so the press picked it up. And while it did not improve the quality of water, what it did was to give a new perspective on how to think about the local economies, which provide such a huge environmental subsidy to the city. Right? If these people are not picking up the waste and segregating it and sending it back into the formal industry, then so many people lose out, right?
Sure.
All formal industry receives material from here. The city gets a huge subsidy from the workers here who are paid very low wages. The employers themselves do not make a huge amount of money. And yet they are making such a wonderful economy actually functional. So that was one project that we did, and we continue to work on that kind of issues in and around Bolakpur, but also looking at waste in other places in the city. How do we create new policies around this? The other thing that we then started doing was to look at transportation in the city. So since we had the online mapping platform, we mapped out all the bus stops and bus routes in the city. We modeled how people move around in the city. And then we figured that there are big areas which we call transit deserts, right, where there is no public transportation available. And the question for us was, if you see on the map places where you don't have buses, then it should either mean that people there don't need buses, which is because they have cars or motorcycles, or because people from there just don't move at all, right? So then we started looking at it closely. We found that these are places actually where a lot of the people who work in the informal employment in hospitals, in shopping malls, in cleaning the streets, all of these lower-end jobs, especially by women, these are places where they live. And what they have been doing is to move around the city in share auto rickshaws. So we were surprised by this insight, and we then put out a request for crowdsourcing data on share auto rickshaw routes in Hyderabad. And we found that there are about 120 routes which are fixed routes for share auto rickshaws. People move using share auto rickshaws from their homes to their workplaces because that's only mobility that is available to them. That then led to a whole bunch of questions about if you have unregulated auto transit in the city, how safe is it? I mean, do we have complaints about women facing harassment from there? How do these people get regulated? What does the police have to say about it? Who do they pay taxes to? Right. So we started investigating all of those things. So right now we are actually putting together a document on auto rickshaw drivers' experiences and the structural issues around how this auto rickshaw industry is organized. So that document should be released very soon in the next 1 or 2 months.
Friends, NRI Samay is a non-profit independent alternate media from Los Angeles, USA, which brings positive stories from grassroots activists from all corners of India and across the world. NRI Samay does not rely on corporate funding and our shows are commercial free. We only rely on your donations. Corporate funded media is driven by the TRP rating and profits are blurring the distinction between news and entertainment. Why do our news channels talk so much about cricket, movies, accidents, popular figures' personal lives, babies of heroines, gossips, etc., while they should be covering the struggles of people, inequality in our society, rural issues, and border security issues? Why did our media raise some corruption crusaders to the sky on one day and shut them off completely when graft charges were raised on those corporate sponsors? Media relies so much on the corporate funding and government blessings that they cannot report independently. NRI Samay is different. We don't accept funds from any corporations and hence our shows are commercial free. We completely rely on donations from you. Please consider donating to NRI Samay and please go to nrisamay.com and donate generously. This is the only way together that we can continue NRI Samay. All donations are kept transparent on nrisamay.com. And if you have any questions, please write to nrisamay@gmail.com.
Okay. Now, one interesting aspect with this whole urbanization is obviously you did touch upon a few issues, as in the the unauthorized sector. There's a tremendous growth in that sector, but the sudden influx of the people into the city as part of this whole process, what happens to those people in terms of their housing? Obviously it leads into building of slums and propagation of them. And would they leave after let's say they are brought in to build or construct these companies or other infrastructure related projects? Would they come in and settle down here, or would they go back to the places where they originally came from? How does that phenomenon work?
So in Hyderabad, and this varies from city to city, but there are some broad trends in terms of migration into the city. Right? There's one particular type of migration which is called seasonal migration or circular migration, which means that people do not lose their contact with the village. They're constantly circulating between the village and the city. Right? They come into the city for a few months, they go back to their agricultural lands, which may be very small, but they do have some ties to the village. People like that do not necessarily plan on settling down in the city. And this happens in many different sectors. You have one of the larger known established institutionalized migration of this kind is the brick kilns. You find that from 3 districts in Orissa, Koraput, Kalahandi, and Bolangir, called the KBK region, about 2 lakh workers migrate out of those 3 districts every year in the season for making bricks. And the majority of them come to Hyderabad and work around the city in smaller villages. They make bricks and they go back. They stay right there. Now, obviously, right, this kind of a thing poses all sorts of challenges in terms of education. How do you set up schools for people whose children are not staying in one place? What happens to the mother tongue? Where do the services come from? So on and so forth. Then you have people who come into the city from particular backgrounds who may be tentative when they come into the city, but eventually figure out that they do want to live in the city. One of the commonsensical wisdom in Hyderabad is, which I keep hearing a lot from a lot of people who come into the city, is that if you make it in 10 years, you have made it. If you don't, then you haven't. That's all, right? If you have failed to find your feet in the city in 10 years' time, then you're not going to be able to go back to your village, and you're not going to be able to stay in the city. You're a failure in life. So people struggle in such situations to find a foothold in the city. That means that by the end of those 10 years, you should have one tiny plot somewhere in which you have a stake. One tiny flat somewhere in which you have a stake. Right? They struggle to save money. They struggle to find some land that they can squat upon, some land that they can buy in whatever means, whether they have a patta or not, whether they have a document or not. They want that piece of property which they can claim as their own. You will usually find people like that in the auto rickshaw, cab driving, car driving kind of populations. You'll find a lot of people like that. And then you have people who rent houses in the city and stay, and they just remain in those rented houses. But a lot of the people who come in at the lower ends of the economy actually settle down around the city. And this has to do with the peculiar history of housing development policy in India. You see, until 1970, the government of India pretty much believed that, or at least pretended that, we know how many households are there in this country, we know how many built units are there in this country, and we have a gap, and we can plan and allocate money for that and build those houses. Right? That went on until 1970, when they pretty much said that, look, this is a game that we cannot play. We cannot build as many houses. So what do you do when the government realizes that they can't build as many houses as the people need? What they do then at that point is to say that, well, people are actually staying somewhere or the other. They have some kind of a roof over their heads, which could be just a plastic sheet. We are going to be tolerant towards them. Where possible, we will give them some tenure security, right? If it is not in a terribly dangerous area, if it is not a disputed property, the government will just give them lease rights. It tells them that, look, you guys can stay here. We'll give you a piece of paper which says that your children can also stay here after you die, but you are not allowed to sell this to anyone. Okay, so that's the kind of policy which was started in the 70s. What they did then was to see wherever possible. They also mobilized some financial resources and said, okay, we'll give you a little bit of loan. You build some kind of housing. You improve your house. We'll give you water. We'll give you sanitation, so on. So if you look at Hyderabad, Vijayawada, and Visakhapatnam, all three cities, the slums that were recognized in the 80s are the ones which are doing really well even now. They're stabilized. They're decent, fairly decent housing with fairly decent infrastructure and services. The original people to whom these houses may have been given may not be living there, but they may not have sold it off through proper registration of property, right? Because it is a leasehold. You can't transfer it directly. So what they do is to write a power of attorney. They write a small notarized document and then transfer it to somebody else and go away. So this happens in the 80s and 90s. Mid-90s also this was happening. After that, you find that people have been coming into the city. They can't find a place in the city to settle down. So what do? They settle down on the edges of the city. So if you go to Vijayawada, for example, and look at the canals, you will find that all along the canals, Vijayawada is a beautiful city with lots of canals. And the canals extend beyond the city limits. A mile after the city limit, you will find people still living along the canals. They don't come into the municipal slums, but they live there. You go to Hyderabad, you will find that there are places all around the city where there are settlements like this, right? And there's a beautiful article written by an economist sometime back, which is called Bypassing Squalor, right? The city grows, the city becomes richer, but it bypasses this kind of squalor altogether. It doesn't take notice of it. You go to a place like Jawahar Nagar, for example, which is about 20 kilometers from the city, and the city pretty much extends all the way there. It's a village with a population of about 2 lakhs. Right? By no stretch of imagination it can be called a village. There's no rural economy there. Right? And yet, everybody living there works in the city. There are 42 colonies there. That's what the village actually is. 42 colonies of workers who come into the city, work, and go back. So they rent houses, they settle down there, sometimes they buy the plot, sometimes they get pattas, sometimes they don't, so on and so forth, but they live there. Villages like this are there all around the city. So that's where the newer slums are coming up. Much bigger, much larger. There are settlements, there's squatter settlements. They do not necessarily have any documents, but they're there. So this is the way in which this has been growing. Right? In the city, the older settlements are all pretty much settled. There's no possibility of new large populations coming in and settling down. If they do, they come in as tenants. They come in as tenants in the slums. And in fact, one of the things that is rarely ever understood by policymakers is that every slum has a very large tenant population. People rent houses there. So that's where they come in.
So they are in turn renting these places out to other people who are migrating into the city newly.
Yes. So I feel that, when the Hyderabad area was getting developing, there were a number of stretches where it was possible for these kinds of squatter settlements to emerge. They have emerged and they have stabilized. So take for example, the Shekhpet Mandal. In that Mandal, you will find, near the Shekhpet Cheru itself, a very large number of slums, 18 or 19 slums, almost close to each other. They were all settled in the late 90s, the last 15, 20 years.
Interesting phenomenon. Right. Now, what happens to, especially we keep hearing during the elections that, the politicians somehow are more sympathetic towards this section of the population, probably is because of the, huge vote banks. But they do keep promising, either they will regularize all these slums or try and rehabilitate the people living in the slums. Does that really happen? Have you seen that actually happen in Hyderabad?
No, this is where the peculiar turn in the Indian economy actually happened, right? So when I said that earlier, that until 1970s, they were making these calculations about how many households and how many built units. That kind of approach began again anew in the mid-90s. But this time, the government said the government will not build it. It will be built by the private sector. Right? Private sector will build it, and sometimes it will be done through public-private partnership. But why will a public-private company be interested in something like this unless they can make profit? So the deal that was offered to them is that you take half the land on which the slum settlement is, and you build apartments there, and in the other half you build 3-storied, 4-storied houses for the poor. That's what the Rajiv Awas Yojana program is all about. Now, programs like this are constantly talked about, but they fail most of the time simply because people don't want to move into those apartments, except in some very special circumstances. That is because of a number of reasons. One reason is that if you build a 3-storied house and you don't have a lift, people who live on the 3rd floor are going to be in a terrible shape. In some cases, the contractor is not interested in this house because he's not making money from this, right? So they don't build it properly. So the quality of construction is bad. And then the biggest problem is that when you live in a horizontal slum, even if you have just one room, you can extend your house in all sorts of ways. You could come out into the street and wash your utensils, wash your clothes. You can sit there on the street along with other women and do home-based production work. All of this becomes impossible in an apartment complex. These opportunities are just not there. Right? So it's a very different kind of social and spatial arrangement that completely alienates poor people, and they refuse to move into it. And one final thing that most people say is that, look, as long as I'm living on the ground, on the earth, if my son grows up and says, I want a room, I can build one more room on top of my house. If you move me into an apartment, there's no way I can stretch it, there's no way I can extend. You're locking me spatially. Right? You're arresting me, and I can't grow, I can't adjust. I don't want to move. Now, what has happened is that many of these schemes which have been planned have just not been implemented anywhere. But there is another thing that the governments have been doing. In the last 7 or 8 years, there were 2 attempts to do something called regularization of land. So this was done during Y.S. Rajshekar Reddy's time in 2008 or something, where they said people who are living on so-called encroached houses, land, and if they are below the poverty line, they will get the land regularized in their name. And they found that 90% of the applications were on lands which simply cannot be regularized. So only I think about 10,000 or so were actually processed and cleared. The present government has also made a similar promise. They're trying to expand the possibility of regularizing land by exempting some types of objectionable land. We don't know to what extent it will be completed. We don't know how many people will actually get it and so on, because the process is not complete yet. But they seem to be making some good faith effort. But ultimately, you're looking at, in Hyderabad city alone, within the Hyderabad district, there were something like 90,000 applications, which simply means that 90,000 families in the city are saying that, look, we have no right to be staying where we are staying. Please give us some kind of a paper that says we have a right to stay. Right? So this is a scale of the problem. 90,000 applications means that even if you take that each of those sites involves only one family, which is not necessarily true, because it could be a 2-storied, 3-storied building also.
Right.
You're looking at 5-6 lakh population, which is living in spaces on which they feel that they have no legal right to stay. And we don't know to what extent the government will be able to clear that.
Right. Now, given all these challenges, obviously, what do you see, or how do you see Hyderabad Lab move forward? Like, what are your immediate goals that you have set for yourself?
So one of the things that we are actually working on right now is that we feel that the whole, in each of these cases, we have a different approach where we are trying to build knowledge that will be useful for policy making. Say, for example, in the transportation thing, the story that we are trying to put together with all the data is to ask the simple question: why do auto rickshaw drivers seem to be charging more? Right? One big complaint everybody has about auto rickshaw drivers is that they don't go by meter. It seems like just because auto rickshaw drivers are greedy, and we claim that they are not greedy, they're just not making enough money. So the question is, where is the money going, right? You're paying the money, but the auto rickshaw driver is not able to keep that money. Somebody else is taking it. So what we are trying to do is to identify the financing arrangements, and in our estimate, about 40 to 50% of the auto rickshaw driver's income is just taken away by somebody else, by the traffic police, by the financiers, and so on and so forth. So unless we have a proper, decent financing system for auto rickshaws and develop a good metering system. See, in Hyderabad, in fact, in much of India, auto rickshaw meters count only distance. They don't count time. So if it takes you, half an hour to go 1 kilometer, the auto rickshaw driver still gets the same amount of money for 1 kilometer. Traffic condition is not counted, unlike in the cab meters in the US. So there are technical solutions, there are policy solutions, financing solutions which have to be found, and we're working on that, and we'll be publishing that. The housing thing, our belief is that we have to recognize at least a percentage of the housing that people have built for themselves and provide the necessary support instead of turning them into illegal, encroaching kind of populations. We should not criminalize it. Because normally what happens for poor people is that their ability to absorb credit is very limited. See, they borrow 10,000 rupees and they can pay it off. You lock them into a 75,000 rupees or 5 lakh rupees loan, they are flustered. They can't deal with it. Right? So you need to understand how people actually deal with credit. One of the reasons why the 80s slum development policy actually worked so beautifully was that they were not burdened with huge loans. I give you 5,000 rupees, you lay the foundation. I give you 10,000 rupees, you lay the walls. Right? That's how it grows incrementally. We need to figure out solutions like that in housing. We also need to figure out ways of making renting of houses actually quite a decent option. Our policy absolutely has no room for thinking about tenants. We had an old law on rent control. That's useless now. So what we are trying to do there is to say that for a lot of people, a house is actually a place where they build their lives. They don't think of it as property that can be traded. Right? If that's the case, we need to take that life fact into account in making policies. So what we are doing is to put together both the legal issues and the life experiences of people, and putting together 2 documents which will be published soon. In the next couple of months, something like that, we'll be having that out. We've also been doing some really interesting work on flooding in the city. Right? We don't know in the city, the old contours and hydrological systems have all changed. We don't know which way the water flows when it rains now. So we've been working with satellite imagery, trying to develop contour maps of the city, and then see what we can do with that. So that's the kind of research work that we've been doing in the water-related issues. We've been working on public toilets and why they don't function very well and how they should be financed and located. So we did this analysis of where are public toilets located in the city and how they are financed and what is the quality of those toilets. So that report has also been published, and we're trying to build some pressure around that. Unfortunate thing is that given the nature of our work, we don't get to publicize it so much in the local languages. Because that requires a particular kind of set of resources. We also don't have the capacity to lobby for policy. We don't want to get into that space simply because it requires a particular kind of expertise and dedication. Going and meeting with officials, pushing certain kind of policies.
True.
That's a different kind of work. I've done that kind of work. It's not that I don't know how to do it, but it's also important to build up this capacity to do research on behalf of people. Mm-hmm. And that's what we are focusing on right now, to really, really, with all the academic rigor, make the academia and make the academic skills, make technological skills work for ordinary people in their lives. Build the capacity, and in 1 or 2 years' time, then we will be able to expand into the space of making these things work through the government systems.
Mm. Got it. All right, Anand, thank you very much for your time. It was really enlightening to know some of the challenges of urbanization, and it's even more, pleasantly surprising that there are solutions that could be worked out, which are very much plausible. So thank you very much for your time. And for listeners, you can visit hydrabadlab.in, hydlab.in, to learn more about the work, and you can even wish to contribute to their work and their organization.
Thank you, Suresh, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Friends, if you liked today's show, please go to youtube.com/NRI Samay and click on the subscribe button. You will get notified every time we publish a new show. And you can also like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+.